What if the past, the history you trust, was actively being rewritten right now? Not by accident, I mean, but like by design. What if the battle for history isn't just about truth, but actually about control over your future? Well, that's a powerful idea to sit with, isn't it? Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into a book that grapples with precisely this question. It's called Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future, and it's by Jason Stanley. Now, Stanley is a pretty significant voice in contemporary philosophy. He's the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and also a distinguished professor at the Kiev School of Economics. You might already know him from his previous work, maybe How Propaganda Works or How Fascism Works. They're pretty incisive, too. And what truly grounds his intense focus on authoritarianism is a deeply personal connection. His parents were actually refugees from Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and understanding the timing, the backdrop against which this book was published is really essential, I think. Erasing History came out in 2024. It's definitely a work of political philosophy, but also contemporary analysis, building on his earlier stuff. And it arrives, in a moment of undeniable political polarization. And particularly relevant to his whole thesis, there's been this significant surge in educational restrictions, especially in the United States. I mean, we've seen over 70 laws passed restricting how things like history, race, sex, and gender can be taught just since 2021. So Stanley's book tries to place these current events within a much broader historical and theoretical frame.
Before we go deeper, just a quick note for you listening. You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM for deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Okay, so at its core, Stanley's central argument is quite stark, really. He's saying that authoritarian regimes, especially those with fascist leanings, systematically manipulate and actively erase historical narratives. He doesn't see this as just like a side tactic. No, he views it as a fundamental strategy to consolidate and maintain power. The core idea is that the battle for historical memory is truly central to authoritarianism, basically replacing diverse perspectives with a single, often mythologized narrative. And that narrative is designed to justify group hierarchies and ultimately suppress democratic discourse.
Okay, so with that really weighty thesis in mind, let's unpack this book. We're not just aiming to, summarize its points. We want to truly dive into his assertions, weigh the evidence he presents, and critically assess its overall impact. What makes Stanley's critique so compelling, and maybe where might it invite us for further thought or even challenge some of his conclusions? Stanley builds his case pretty meticulously, doesn't he? It's structured around several key claims that form the foundation. So what's his initial, bedrock assertion about where these movements first focus their energy?
Right. His first claim, which he argues is absolutely paramount, is that fascism fundamentally targets education. That's its primary battleground. And he provides a lot of evidence for this. He draws from historical fascist regimes and also contemporary authoritarian movements. He even quotes Adolf Hitler, who chillingly said, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future."
Wow.
Yeah. And the book then documents how many modern authoritarian leaders, figures from Trump to Putin, have focused attacks directly on educational institutions. It really seems to illustrate this strategy in action.
Okay, so if education is the battleground, what specific patterns does Stanley say authoritarians use to rewrite history? He's not talking about just random suppression, is he?
Exactly, no. He identifies 5 recurring themes in what he calls fascist education.
Mm-hmm.
These are things like the glorification of national greatness, often this mythologized pursuit of national purity, the assertion of national innocence, which is basically avoiding blame for past wrongs. Then there's the rigid enforcement of strict gender roles and the consistent vilification of political opponents, especially the left. And he backs these themes up with some powerful case studies looking at examples from Nazi Germany, contemporary Russia, Hungary, and also what he sees happening in the United States.
It really sounds like a lot of this hinges on how language itself gets twisted, which leads to his number 3 claim, right? That propaganda operates through coded language and myth-making. This connects back to his earlier work, doesn't it? How does Stanley argue this coded language actually, cuts off rational deliberation and discussion?
Oh, that connection to his previous work on propaganda is absolutely crucial.
Oh, yes.
He meticulously analyzes how certain terms in political discourse, he uses examples like welfare, inner city, even fiscal cliff, function as coded language.
Right.
He argues these aren't just neutral words. They're used, maybe intentionally or maybe unintentionally, to create narratives that obscure reality. They undermine democratic deliberation, effectively shut down genuine discussion. They become these loaded terms designed to evoke specific negative emotional responses rather than, encourage reasoned thought.
And then his number 4 claim brings us right up to today. He asserts that many educational restrictions we're seeing now have these eerie parallels to historical fascist tactics. What does he document there, and how does he draw those comparisons?
Well, he documents this widespread wave of educational restrictions that are currently unfolding, particularly in the U.S., and he draws direct, often uncomfortable, comparisons to historical patterns of fascist control over curricula and the manipulation of historical memory. He presents these not as isolated incidents, but more like part of a coherent strategy, one that echoes tactics seen in previous authoritarian situations.
Okay, now let's shift our perspective a bit. Let's see how Stanley's ideas hold up when we analyze them through what you might call an epistemic lens, which is really just a fancy way of saying we're looking at how knowledge is produced and validated here. We can use Adler's hierarchy of knowledge. It helps distinguish between, say, simple opinion, factual knowledge, deeper understanding, and maybe even wisdom. So when we talk about Stanley's assertions, what might fall into the realm of opinion?
Right, so on the level of opinion, Stanley's most pointed assertions probably fit here, especially when he characterizes specific contemporary political figures as fascist or labels current educational debates directly as fascist tactics. These represent, I'd say, informed judgments rather than universally accepted facts or interpretive positions.
Okay.
They're grounded in his framework, definitely, but they remain open to debate. They're not empirically proven like a historical date might be. This is really where Stanley presents his scholarly interpretation, his well-argued opinion about the nature of these contemporary movements.
But then we move up to knowledge, and here the book seems to present a very different picture. Stanley provides substantial factual evidence, right? Because applying Adler's lens show us about this aspect.
It really highlights the strength of his empirical foundation. The book is just packed with documented educational restrictions. There are verifiable patterns in authoritarian movements across different eras, specific laws, policies, institutional changes, things you can concretely observe. These aren't opinions. They're solid factual claims that can be, independently verified. Adler's hierarchy helps us see that beneath his interpretive claims, there's this bedrock of well-researched factual knowledge underpinning the whole argument.
And then when we consider understandings, Stanley clearly demonstrates a pretty profound level of it. He's not just listing facts, he's connecting dots, often disparate ones. What's maybe the most surprising layer of insight Adler helps us uncover about his understanding here?
I think the most striking thing is Stanley's ability to synthesize. It's quite masterful. He connects phenomena across vastly different historical periods and geographical contexts. He weaves together propaganda theory, historical analysis, contemporary politics.
Right.
This isn't just knowing facts. It's comprehending the underlying mechanisms, the why and how these patterns seem to repeat. He shows a genuine, deep understanding of the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways authoritarianism manifests and weaponizes history.
And finally, we get to wisdom. The book certainly seems to approach these ultimate questions about democracy, human dignity, civic responsibility. How does Stanley's work, when we look at it through the lens of wisdom, offer some guidance?
Well, Stanley's warnings about the long-term consequences of erasing history and his really urgent call for vigilance in protecting historical truth, that demonstrates a kind of practical wisdom regarding democratic preservation. He's looking beyond the immediate events to the enduring picture, to the fundamental questions of what makes a society just and free. His work really compels us to reflect on the ultimate aims of education and the profound responsibility we have, especially to future generations, to preserve an honest historical record.
Now, if we apply something we call the Golden Rule assessment, basically asking if Stanley's recommendations would hold up if the roles were reversed, we find some strong points, maybe also some areas that give us pause. Let's look first at where his arguments seem to pass this ethical test pretty clearly.
Okay. Well, Stanley's defense of inclusive education, for example, that clearly passes the reciprocity test. The principle of preserving diverse historical perspectives, advocating for academic freedom. These generally benefit all groups and perspectives when applied consistently right across the political spectrum.
Sure.
Those who might seek to restrict narratives today would, theoretically, want their own historical narratives preserved and defended if roles were reversed, or if they were the ones being erased. This kind of consistent application of principles makes it a strong ethical stance. However, this assessment also reveals some potential limitations in his approach. His frequent characterization of opponents as fascist might struggle to pass an empathy test.
Ah, interesting point.
Yeah, it prompts the question,
Right.
would he want his own scholarly work, his own nuanced philosophical arguments, just dismissed with comfortable labels, potentially without fully engaging with his complexity?
Right, without grappling with the actual substance.
Exactly. This highly partisan framing, while maybe aiming to clarify a threat he perceives, paradoxically risks undermining the very scholarly objectivity and open dialogue that he champions as essential for a healthy democracy.
So what does all this mean when we evaluate the book against those aspirational aims embedded in a foundational democratic framework? Let's use the U.S. Constitution's preamble as a kind of benchmark. How does the book align with or maybe challenge these core principles?
Okay, let's try that. For Form a More Perfect Union, I'd probably assess it at maybe a 7 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
Stanley definitely champions an honest historical reckoning, which is vital for genuine national unity.
Mm-hmm.
Yet that strong fascist labeling, while maybe intended to clarify threats, could paradoxically risk alienating potential allies. It might make the more perfect union he desires harder to achieve through shared dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to established justice, I think the book scores higher, maybe an 8 out of 10. It places a really strong emphasis on educational equity and historical justice,
Right.
particularly for marginalized groups whose histories are often the first to be erased or distorted. That focus is a direct call for a more just society built on truth, for ensured domestic tranquility, maybe a 6 out of 10. While Stanley profoundly argues for peace through truth-telling, believing it's essential for stability, the book's often confrontational tone and stark language might, at times, actually exacerbate existing tensions rather than soothe them. It could create more friction in the short term. In terms of provide for the common defense, I'd rate it an 8 out of 10. Stanley makes a compelling case that defending democratic institutions, including educational freedom and historical integrity, isn't just academic. He argues it's an essential national security issue, critical for protecting the very fabric of society from authoritarian threats. For promote the general welfare, it gets a high score, I think a 9 out of 10. The book's excellent focus on educational and civic welfare is paramount here. It really emphasizes that an informed citizenry, grounded in an accurate understanding of history, is crucial for everyone's flourishing, contributing directly to the nation's general well-being. And finally, secure the blessings of liberty, also a strong 9 out of 10. Stanley offers a powerful, urgent defense of intellectual freedom and democratic participation. He basically positions protecting historical truth as fundamental to ensuring future generations can inherit and exercise genuine liberty, free from manipulative narratives.
Okay, let's dig into the logical construction of Stanley's argument itself now. Every strong argument has foundations that really shine and sometimes points where it might stumble a little. So what would you say are its core logical strengths?
Well, the book demonstrates several key logical strengths, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, there's a really consistent application of its analytical framework across very different historical periods and political contexts. That's vital for showing overarching patterns.
Right.
Secondly, it has strong empirical grounding. It draws from a wealth of documented policies, laws, historical patterns, providing a robust, fact-based foundation for the claims. And thirdly, it builds on a coherent theoretical foundation, integrating established scholarship on propaganda and fascism very effectively.
But like you said, no argument is entirely invulnerable. Where does the logic maybe show potential weaknesses or even fallacies?
I'd probably point to a few potential areas. One might be a kind of false dichotomy, meaning the book sometimes presents education debates as this binary choice. It's either fascism or democracy.
Ah, okay, black and white.
Yeah, which might overlook legitimate middle positions or more complex motivations behind certain policies. Another could be hasty generalization. It might extrapolate a bit too broadly from specific educational restrictions to suggest this systemic, inevitable fascist transformation across the whole society.
Instead of maybe localized shifts.
Exactly, or more nuanced political changes. There's also perhaps an ad hominem tendency at times, where critique of policies might occasionally blend into what could be perceived as personal attacks on political figures, which can distract from the argument itself. And finally, maybe some confirmation bias could be at play, where the book selectively emphasizes evidence supporting the fascism thesis while possibly minimizing or downplaying contradictory data or alternative explanations.
As we navigate these really intricate and sometimes challenging ideas, it feels like a perfect moment to remind you about mindful moments. That's our YouTube channel. We offer AI, book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all designed specifically to inspire reflection and rational thought. It's really all about creating space for deeper engagement, much like we're trying to do right now with this book, helping you process complex information thoughtfully. So, looking beyond the immediate arguments and their logical structure, what long term considerations does this book compel us to wrestle with, and what deeper questions does it leave us pondering? Thinking about this from the perspective of wisdom again.
Well, Stanley's warnings about democratic erosion through educational control,
Hmm.
they definitely merit serious long-term consideration, no doubt about that. History just provides clear, consistent patterns of authoritarian regimes actively targeting schools and universities as these crucial sites of control. However, it's maybe worth noting that the rather, let's say, apocalyptic framing of some of these warnings might, ironically, undermine the constructive dialogue needed for democratic solutions. It could potentially entrench divides rather than bridging them between groups who might otherwise find common ground. Also, the book, in my view, could have maybe delved deeper into the economic dimensions of these educational policy debates.
Ah, interesting. How so?
Stanley briefly mentions oligarchic interests as driving certain policies, but he doesn't fully explore how fundamental economic inequality and class interest intersect with, and often drive, these educational restrictions. Understanding those power dynamics more thoroughly could really enrich the analysis beyond a purely ideological frame, I think. And from a, let's say, spiritual dimension, the work does touch on transcendent questions about human dignity and the intrinsic value of democratic ideals, which is commendable. Yet, it remains primarily secular in its orientation. Stanley's framework could potentially benefit from deeper engagement with religious and spiritual traditions. Many of these have historically provided incredibly powerful sources of resistance to authoritarianism and offered moral frameworks for protecting truth and human rights.
This really does raise some truly important questions for all of us, doesn't it? Questions for long-term reflection. Like, how can societies effectively balance these competing demands for historical accuracy, robust civic education, and also the preservation of diverse cultural identities? It's a tough balance.
Exactly. And what truly constitutes legitimate versus illegitimate educational restrictions in pluralistic democracies? Where do we actually draw that line? Furthermore, how do economic and class interests genuinely shape educational policy, often beyond a simple fascist democratic dichotomy? And what implications does that have for the future of our societies? These are really profound questions the book prompts, but doesn't fully resolve, leaving them for us, the listeners, to consider and explore further. So to wrap things up, Jason Stanley's Erasing History definitely succeeds as an urgent and meticulously documented warning about genuine threats to democratic education and historical memory. These are threats that absolutely deserve serious attention. Its greatest strength, I'd say, lies in its scholarly rigor and its comprehensive documentation of these concerning authoritarian patterns across various contexts. However, its greatest weakness, in our assessment, might stem from what can be perceived as a rather partisan application of these insights, and at times maybe an overreach in its terminology. This approach, while forceful, potentially risks undermining its own scholarly objectivity and hindering the kind of broad, constructive dialogue that's really essential for democratic solutions. But despite this, the book offers strong practical relevance and a firm historical grounding, making it a significant and timely contribution to a really essential discussion.
So, to sum it up for you listening, you should probably engage with Stanley's powerful warnings, absorb the crucial patterns he identifies, but also make sure to actively seek out additional perspectives. This approach allows you to develop a more nuanced, a more comprehensive understanding of the complex educational and political challenges we face today. It's about taking in the core message, but processing it through a broader, more critical lens, you know?
Ultimately, the book compels us to ask a really critical question. If controlling the narrative is truly a path to controlling the future, then whose narrative are we inadvertently allowing to shape our understanding of the past right now?
These kinds of nuanced discussions, exploring complex ideas and encouraging deep reflection, are exactly what we aim for with Mindful Moments and all of our podcasts. We believe in providing thoughtful analysis to help you navigate intricate topics with clarity.
And we do want you to know that our rigorous assessment of this book, the one we've shared today, was guided by a systematic framework. It's designed to provide a precise evaluation across various dimensions, everything from logical consistency to ethical implications, and its alignment with core democratic principles. This ensures a thorough and balanced critique.
For the in-depth book analysis and to continue this journey of rational thought and informed discussion, click the link on screen. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.